Alright, today I want to do a hopefully quick demo of using Forms, Power Automate, and SharePoint to manage signups for events. Now, this is kind of a unique scenario where we're basically going to assume that you're only running one event at a time. So basically the form itself is going to be the same every time, but we want a way that to set it up so that when these are recorded, the name of the current workshop is being recorded somewhere. Now, we could do this a number of ways. We could include a question on the form that we go in and change every time. We could manually update the flow every time, but I wanted it to be a little more dynamic. So we'll just start with the form here, and then I'll show the two SharePoint lists that we're going to use to make all this happen. So our workshop sign up form here is pretty simple. It just says as for name, email, and then specialties. So nothing fancy, but obviously whatever other information you want to capture in your sign up form, have at it. Now there are two SharePoint lists that we're going to be using here. The first one is a list of our workshops. So now the reason that I say this is kind of unique is that in most cases, most people that are running workshops are running many workshops at a time. So you do need sort of a way to figure out which one the person's signing up for, in which case kind of a choice question in the form is really the best way to do that. For the purposes of what we're talking about, we want to do it a little bit more simply. So we're running one workshop a week. So we can see that last week was tunnel digging, this week is costumes and disguises, next week is pole vaulting, the following is advanced evasion. So we can see those are dated each Friday, and we've just got a column here for the title of the workshop, a current workshop, which is a yes/no column. So when you're creating this column in your list, you want to be sure that you set it, well, it doesn't matter what you set the default value to, but you want to ensure that only the one that you are currently accepting registrations for is checked. So it is kind of important. If you check multiples here, then it's going to return multiples, but the first one, the way we're going to set up the first one that is checked as current is the one that, that's the information that's going to be used. So keep that in mind. But basically here we also have a column for the date, for the time, the location, and the ID column is one that already exists in SharePoint. I just added it to this view. And you don't need to add it to the view, but basically if you want to, simply click Add Column, Show or Hide, and then check ID and click Apply. And the reason this is important is that this is an auto-incrementing number that won't ever be repeated. So pole vaulting is ID number 3. There will never be another item in this list that is ID number 3. Even if this is deleted and another with the same name is created, it'll have a different ID. So that's going to be important to remember, because that's how we're essentially going to match up the registrations to the workshop in order to send out a reminder in another video. Not this video, but in the next one we'll cover that aspect of it. So this is our workshops list. And then we have the workshop signups list, which is pretty straightforward, simply a title. The workshop ID, this is going to be a number column. If I edit the column, we'll see that that is a type number, and that will be for that ID number of the workshop in the workshops list. And then we obviously have the registrant name, email, and specialties. And again, if you had other questions on your form, you would want a column here for each of those, but this is all we need right now. So jumping into our flow, it's a pretty straightforward standard flow. We've got the when a new response is submitted trigger, and because it is a group form, we need to use that big ugly ID to get the responses. And then same for the response details, use that form ID, and then for the response ID, just select response ID from the dynamic content. Now this is where things get a little fun. So now we need to use a get items action, and get items in the SharePoint connector is used to retrieve one or more items from a SharePoint list. So our goal here is to get the items from that SharePoint list, but we want to filter it to the current one. Now, a couple things to be aware of, because this is a get items action. Even if it only returns one item, it's still going to be formatted as an array or a list of items. So we need to take a little extra special care to be sure we don't get thrown into an apply to each loop unnecessarily. But basically, if we left this as delivered, so the standard view or standard configuration is going to return all of the items. If I want to filter it based on that current workshop column, I need to type in the column name, which is going to be current workshop. Even if you create it with a space, SharePoint will remove that space, so the actual internal column name will just be current workshop without any space. It is case sensitive, so be sure that you have the right, the actual internal name of your column. And then EQ for equals, and then the number 1. Now, it sounds weird because that's a yes/no column in SharePoint, and I said it's a Boolean true false, but true and false can also numerically be represented by 1 and 0. So by saying current workshop equals 1, it's going to return any items in that list where the current workshop checkbox is checked. I could also, if I wanted to, put in the number 1 here for the top count to say only bring me back the first item. The reality is, if you are diligent about making sure that only one item is checked, then it will only return one item. Also, if you don't do that, if you check 2, it's basically going to start at the beginning of the list and return them in the order that they were created. So if there are 3, it's going to get all 3, but in a subsequent step, we're going to use the first, the first item returned from this. So really the top count, you could throw it in there, but you really don't need to. Just something to be aware of. In other scenarios, you might end up needing to use that or wanting to use that. So anyway, that's basically going to be it for returning the workshop from the list, the one that is marked as the current workshop. Now, when I want to create the item in that SharePoint list, so I'll just add a create item action here. I can click, create item and go to my escape planning list and the workshop signups list. And then it's going to bring in the schema for that list. So I've got title, workshop ID, name, email, specialties. Now for the title, I wanted to use the workshop title. Now this is I'm just going to demonstrate that what I warned you about. So if I go in here and say, get the title from get items, it's going to throw that into this apply to each loop. Now, because only one item should be returned, it isn't a big deal, isn't a huge deal, but still it's kind of ugly and something that you can avoid. So let me show you how to avoid it kind of the right way, or one of the right ways. There are at least a half a dozen different ways to attack this. I'm just going to show you the way that I prefer to do it. Now, stepping back a little bit, come on. This is going to be a pain. Yeah, let's get rid of that. Okay. Now, this get items is returning a list of items. There is a similar get item action. So if I type in get item singular from the SharePoint connector. Now they look similar, except one is singular, one's plural. The singular get item retrieves a single item, but it uses the ID number of that item. So I can't, unless I knew the ID number from the very beginning, I couldn't get just that one entry. But now that I know I have the output of this, which is giving me a list of those which are current, I can use that to get the first, get the ID number, or use the ID number of the first item that's returned to get that item itself. So again, this sounds a little redundant, sounds complicated, but this is actually the simplest, the cleanest way to do it. So I'm going to go in there and go to escape workshops. Now for the ID, I do need to do a little bit of extra typing here. So again, if I were to simply select get items ID, it's going to create that loop, which is not what I want. Now, what I wanted to use is the first expression. First is basically when you have a list of things, an array of things, first will return the first element from that array. So if I go over to expression, type in first, and then go back to our dynamic data. Now the problem is that it's now not showing me, it's only showing me those things from get items which are arrays. Even though the output of that ID is an array, I can't directly select it. So I just need to, so this is part, needs to just pay special attention, because I'm going to select value, which basically means get me the first value from that list or that array. And then at the very end of it, so after that closing parenthesis, I need to put a question mark, open square bracket, single quote, and then capital ID. And then it'll automatically add the closing single quote and closing square bracket for you. If it doesn't, be sure that it looks just like this. So body slash value, square bracket, question mark, square bracket, single quote, ID, blah, blah, blah. You see it just like that. And once you have that, you can click OK. And now this get item, and I'll just rename this just to keep things clean, get item by ID. And then in our create item, the nice part about this is that now when I go into title, I can use the output of that get item by ID, and I can select title there, and it doesn't create that loop because I've now essentially working from an object as opposed to an array, which means I can very easily select those values I need from the dynamic content. So we did a little extra work here to make our life easier down here. And then I can also select from the workshop ID. That will be get item by ID, and then the name will be the that'll be from our the get response details. We'll put in the name, we'll put in the email. Oh, that's not what I want. Email, and then specialties. Okay, easy enough. Good to go. So that is that. I'll hit save here, and then we will submit this form just to make sure everything works the way we want it to. So let's say the first person is Bob, and his email is bob@bob.com, and his specialty is electrical and munitions. Sure, why not? Submit that. So if we go over to our escape planning site, our escape workshop signups, refresh, there is costumes and disguises, which is our current workshop. Perfect. And there is the workshop ID, name of the attendee, the email, and the specialties. Now, this last part is a little ugly. So because that is a multi-select choice column, the data is coming in the form of an array, because people can select more than one value. We could do a little extra work cleaning that up and making it look a little nicer, which, yeah, let's do that just to be a little more, detail oriented here. So I'm going to, way up here after get response details, I'm going to add an action. And I am going to type in join, and we're going to use the join data operation. And join is something you use when you want to basically convert an array into a string. So you can take an array of data. So our specialties is an array, so it's something, comma, something, comma, something. And I want to format it into a nicer list. So I'm going to select as the input the specialties, and I'm going to join that with a comma and a space. So and I'll just rename this to make it clean. Join specialties, And then if I go down to our create item, I will use the output of that join. So I can just type in output. So a lot of these data operations, the output is just called output. It's can be a little confusing, which is why it's really important to name your actions appropriately, because the dynamic content is going to be, the dynamic content value property name is going to be repeated. So name your actions in a way that makes sense. So I'll select that output. If I hit save, and we'll just throw another response in here, and this will be Joe at joe.com. And let's say his specialties are camouflage and excavation. Hit submit, and when we look at our list here, something didn't work right. So let's see. That failed. Okay, I see what the problem is. I forgot one little step here. So the problem is that I need to put that array of data into a proper JSON format. So I can't just use specialties. I need to use an extra expression here called JSON. Again, don't worry about, there are certain things you should know about JSON. It's basically a structure for data, or a type of data structure. But the point is that it is the data that comes into a flow is typically in JSON format. If not, you need to put it in JSON format. So I just need to use the JSON expression, and then for the dynamic content, we will put in that specialties and click OK. And then when I hit save, and we will run that flow again that failed. And it worked. So now in our workshop signups, we have very nicely camouflage, excavation. So that's basically just another trick to get rid of those ugly square brackets and quotes and all that. Make your data a little more usable. Now, unfortunately, if you've got a bunch of data like this in your list already, there's no good way to go back and clean it up. But if you set up your flow right to begin with, or at the beginning, then you can not worry about that later. All right, so that is it. Now, as I said, the main reason that we included the ID number, and specifically in the sign-up list, that workshop ID column, is that so later we can have another flow that is going to basically run every day to see if there is a workshop the subsequent day. If there is, it will then get the sign-ups for that and then send them an email to remind them of the session. So again, we'll do that in another video, but hopefully this was useful in terms of understanding how to get the items from that workshops list, filtering to only the current workshop, or the one where the current workshop column has a value of 1 or true or yes, and then how to get the item, basically get that specific item's properties, so the title, the date, the time, and all that, which is going to make your life a little bit easier in creating that item. And also, if we were to add an email in here, so if I want to send an email to them, I'll just do this very quickly using the mail connector. This, by the way, sends an email from a service account, which isn't always ideal, but works. It does work. It's one way to do it. And then I'm just going to send to the email address that they submitted. Now, unfortunately, this is relying on them putting in the correct email into that email question on the form. So if they put in a bad email or an incorrect email, this email that's going to be sent is not going to get to them. So you might just want to put that in, specify that in your form to say, be sure to put in a correct email address so that we can remind you of this. And then the subject will be the workshop or registration complete for the, and then we'll use title. Now you'll notice that title is going to show up in create item because that's a value we set there. It's also in get item by ID. I'll just use it from there. It's technically the same value, but it is very important as you start building more complicated flows to understand and to recognize that these data values or the properties could be the same, could be different. So you really need to pay attention to which action you are, that value is coming from. So there you go. And then I can just say, date will be get item date. Time will be time. And location. I'm just doing this very quick. I am not formatting anything or anything. It's very kind of quick and dirty, but you get the idea that it's a lot easier rather than writing a bunch of extra formulas to get that data in here. So we can do that. Now, obviously the email address I made up, so these actually aren't going to send, but you get the idea. So again, in the next video, we'll show how to basically run that flow to remind people of when a workshop is coming up the next day.